Good morning. When I came in, I told Simon that I'm not going to talk about shipping's control strategy in Hong Kong because that sounds like a technical discussion. What I'd like to do is to share some broad perspectives with you about how we got here and where we might go. Now, a number of points I think are important because many of you are fellow travelers. You've been fellow travelers with Civic Exchange. You've been fellow travelers with me personally on this journey, and we're fellow travelers with Hong Kong and with China on this massive journey. The first point I want to make is the speed of change. And I tell you, sitting in government, speed of change is, there's no speed of change. Everything goes very, very slowly. But actually, now that we have 10 years to look back, we can see the speed of change picking up. And what do I mean by the speed of change? Well, at least for me personally, the starting point was around 2005, 2006. And that was the time when we noticed that in the Los Angeles and Long Beach area, there was a lot of discussion about emissions from ships and the health impact that has on people living around there. There were a number of useful reports that talked about the health impact. Well, we picked it up in Hong Kong at that time. It's no secret. I was with Civic Exchange. We looked at the report. And what I imagined at the time was, because I have been to LA and Long Beach many times, that it's just that there are not many people in that area compared to in Asia. The density of population where we are in Hong Kong, where our port is. And of course, when we look at the ports in China, when we look at ports in the developing economies, the density of population is so much larger. So what is the impact on our port cities in this part of the world? It's got to be much bigger. Civic Exchange then started to knock on the doors of the shipping sector and the port sector, and also started a discussion with government. Is this an issue? And around that time, it clearly wasn't really an issue yet for governments around the world. So you could say that in California, they were a leader. But today, in 10 years' time, everybody is talking about it. So the speed of change, looking at what Long Beach and Los Angeles was doing, picked up in Europe, what the EU started to look at. And we started to look at it in Hong Kong, and then where we are today. So I think thinking back, we can see that this issue is actually going at top speed, including now a real conversation about what to do in China. The second point I want to make is really the importance of partnership and co-learning. Simon Ng, I see, is going to talk about the Fair Winds Charter. The Fair Winds Charter is now very famous around the world. It's famous in the shipping and port sector because it was an extraordinary partnership. Having been a part of working with the shipping companies on this, perhaps I can tell you a part of the story that maybe Simon can't fill in. When I joined government in 2012, at the top echelon of the government, people hadn't quite really understood about the Fair Winds Charter. The question that I had at a very senior level was, really? These business people, these big shipping companies, they really want to do this? They really are volunteering? They're asking us to legislate? Because generally, commercial business people discourage government from legislation. So this became quite an interesting topic of internal discussion. Now, the more that people understood what the Fair Winds Charter actually said, I think the more impressed people are. So I'll leave Simon, perhaps when you talk about it, people remember the bit about the Fair Winds Charter on the voluntary fuel switch. They don't necessarily remember the other parts. Now, looking back today, the other parts are extraordinarily visionary, because it asked the Hong Kong government not only to legislate, but to actually reach out to the ports in the PRD, to partner up with them to see if the whole of the PRD ports could do it together. Because they recognized, they were sensitive from the start, that there could be competitive advantages and disadvantages. So this kind of collaboration that you get from honest talking to each other, trust built up over actually a few years. Because the discussion that took place between Civic Exchange and the shipping sector, this was over the course of 3 years. So building partnership, co-learning, understanding each other, it does take time. Now then, I'd like to also talk about looking at what to do from an evidence-based perspective. Now in the US, the start of it had to do with understanding the health impact on people who lived around the port area. In Hong Kong, in 2007, I had a very fruitful discussion with the last Secretary for the Environment, Edward Yao. I talked to him about the evidence from the US, the health impact. And he honestly said, he says, well, we're not thinking of doing anything in the marine sector. This just hasn't been a subject in Hong Kong. But we kind of struck a deal to say, well, if Civic Exchange continued to do some work in this area, could the government consider doing an emission inventory, doing some early evidence-based work? So this was the deal struck, and I think Civic Exchange, part of the deal was, well, we'll continue talking to the shipping and port sector, but when we get somewhere, when people are willing to consider perhaps some action, some exploration of what to do, it'll be really good if government officers could join in so that we can see that there's a chance of really making policy, not just a lot of talk. Right? So Edward Yao was open to this process, and we had a number of officers, one of whom is here today, who traveled with us on this whole process. So there was a tremendous amount of co-learning. And Simon sitting here, he was with HKUST at the time, and we've done an excellent marine emissions inventory in Hong Kong. Now, that took a lot of effort and work. Again, to do a good emissions inventory for a port city like Hong Kong, well, that took a number of years. It isn't just that perhaps the Americans have done it, we can just take theirs, copy it, and do it ourselves. It's not nearly that simple. But Hong Kong is now very proud, I believe, of the government-sponsored emissions inventory, both in terms of the result and the process. And at a technical level, this is something, the competence, the way of doing it can be shared. And I think it is being shared with our colleagues on the mainland. So having that, what was shocking was the result itself. Now, there were two aspects that were quite shocking. One was the number of people who are potentially exposed to the risk of marine emission. Government was able to say, well, actually, the signature of marine emissions goes deep and wide into different parts of Hong Kong. It isn't even just the people who are living and working by the port that are affected. So maybe Simon and others can talk more about that later. The second thing was, for the shipping sector, well, the issue really is truly settled, because as the power sector has been reducing emissions, it turned out that the biggest contributor for the major pollutants were ships. So again, having the evidence to show why we should focus on the marine sector was well settled by about 2012. So then it is relatively easy for government with this evidence to be able to say, we really need to do something. So when I joined the government, in a way, all this background with a very supportive shipping sector was already in place. So the question for government was, are we willing to do what the Fair Winds Charter asked government to do? First of all, legislate. Secondly is reach out to Guangdong and to Shenzhen to see if we can do this together. So with the first policy address in 2013, this commitment was made. And we have been reaching out to our colleagues across the border. In 2013, I was able to go to the Ministry for Environmental Protection in Beijing and talking at a very high level about what were the environmental protection policies of the Hong Kong administration. So one of the key discussions was this new idea about controlling shipping emissions and using fuel switching as probably the lowest hanging fruit. Now, timing, again, is everything. By 2013, clearly the mainland, the leaders in the mainland, were just becoming more and more serious about dealing with air pollution. At the time, like Hong Kong a few years before, they also hadn't quite focused on controlling shipping emissions. So the path that the mainland is now following is similar to what Hong Kong had gone through. So first of all, port cities should do emissions inventory. Secondly is, well, let's have the evidence and then see what port cities can do about what policies they set. But of course, China, when China is ready to move, this is really a big deal. And this is where China is today. I think we all know that in September 2013, the Chinese government put out the national 10 measures for controlling air pollution. This is a new policy at the highest level, and actually provinces and cities all around China have to come up with plans on what they're going to do. Also, certain areas have been given additional new targets to meet. Now, in the national plan, they highlighted 3 specific regions and the expectation of the 3 regions to move faster and further. So the 3 regions are the Beijing-Tianjin area, the Shanghai Yangtze River Delta area, and the Pearl River Delta area, which of course includes Hong Kong and Macau. So as far as air pollution control is concerned, nationally there is a desire for these 3 regions to do their best. Now these 3 regions happen also to be the most developed regions. These 3 regions happen to be the wealthier region. These 3 regions are the concentration of major universities, major institutions of many kinds, and also financial centers, trade centers, and so on. So since then, I think we've had very good and collaborative discussions with our regional and mainland counterparts on enhancing air pollution control strategies. So the last thing I just want to say is let's look at the international picture as well. In the last 10 years, as I said earlier on, there's been a speeding up of focus on port cities, what port cities should do. So it's not just the shipping sector, it's also people who operate ports. I've just come back from a trip to Hamburg to attend an international port gathering, and the 2 days discussion what's really focused on sustainability and how ports have to clean up. Now, of course, for ports to clean up, ports need to have many partners as well. So we need the people who operate the ports, we need the shipping companies that uses the port, the people who are designing new ships even, so that new ships can be more energy efficient and therefore pollute less. So shipping design, shipbuilders, we need to talk about even the companies that provide communication, the so-called Internet of Things. How do we make port smarter? Now, smart port has to do with, again, helping with the efficiency of the coordination of all these people who make ports work and transport goods away from the ports and to the ports. So if we're looking at a total picture of transformation for port cities, the picture is actually much, much bigger still. Now, obviously, for us to do all of these things, what is the role of port authorities, city administrations? They do have to be able to grasp all of these aspects and to see actually how to work with the industry. Now, there are also international bodies, the International Maritime Organization, that are involved in maritime international agreements. So we know that the IMO is going to continue to tighten marine fuel quality and the emissions. We know that there are things now called ECAs, emissions control areas, that nations can apply for. So there was a German minister who talked about German ports and what they call the HKSAR, the sulfur emissions control area, which is now in place in the northern ports of the European Union. And she showed a very interesting chart, and she says this sulfur has clearly gone down a tremendous amount. And then she says, well, actually, we're going to have to work on NOx next. There are other pollutants we need to work on. So the message is, this is not the end of the story. We're going to have to continue to clean up even beyond dealing with sulfur. The second thing that she said was, she says, well, we in the European Union are very keen to see what other parts of the world are going to do. And she showed a picture. She says, well, here are the ECAs and the HKSARs, and we know that there are those in North America, and then here are the ones in Europe. And she says, well, I want to predict maybe, where might be the next place? And she drew ECAs around Japan. Well, afterwards, I was able to say to her, I said, well, the next one might be where we are, in China. And she was so excited. She says, oh, I just haven't heard anything about it. Now, she hadn't heard that we're doing fuel switching at berth in Hong Kong. She hadn't heard that discussions are kind of ongoing in China. It's no secret, with Shenzhen, with Guangdong, and so on. So she was extremely excited to hear this. And as soon as I came back to Hong Kong, she's actually already been in touch with me to say that she really wanted to keep in touch with us so that she could stay abreast of what's happening. Now, the last thing I want to say is this. Regulation is critical to what we need to do. And the shipping sector always knew that, which is why they asked the Hong Kong government not to rely on a voluntary scheme, but to go for legislation. When I was in Hamburg, there was a discussion about whether voluntary versus mandatory. And I stood up and said, look, it's got to be mandatory. People were not quite sure whether voluntary could work or it has to be mandatory. But I think overall, the audience went away thinking it is necessary to mandate. So we're now looking at mandating in other parts of the world beyond North America and Europe. So I'm extremely proud that Hong Kong is able to pass our little piece of legislation, which is just fuel switching at berth. So this is a very early beginning. And if we can do fuel switching at berth in other ports in China, that might be a first step. But obviously, to think longer term about seekers and ekers for Chinese ports, that would be really a tremendous, tremendous step. So just imagine ships crossing the Pacific. When they get to North America, there are so many things they need to do. But when they come back across the Pacific to China, to where we have such dense population, they don't as yet have to do very much. So we're starting in Hong Kong with requiring fuel switching at berth. And thank you again, thank you from the bottom of my heart to the shipping sector to be willing to do that. And thank you, the shipping sector again, for working with us in government to help define what the policy should look like. Because the shipping sector was interested to ensure that as different places pass legislation, hopefully that there's a high level of similarity so that the poor ship, when they go into different ports, they haven't to do different things, that there would be one set of similar rules that could apply globally. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Civic Exchange, for organizing a really, really timely gathering for us. Thank you.